Hi. Are you dissatisfied with the current state of video games? Have you noticed yourself getting a little annoyed, a little bothered, a little frustrated with something that's happened recently, one of your modern consoles or games or a company you like? Well, I'm here to tell you there's a solution. But first, I need to tell you a little story. Story of the crash of 1983. Now, more than likely, if you're a gamer as a hobbyist, you probably are familiar with that already, or at least have heard of it before. So I won't dwell a ton on what it was. I'll explain it in very simple terms. In 1983, the video game market crashed. What that essentially means is not only did it stop being profitable, but it became so incredibly unprofitable. Stores wouldn't even carry video games in their stock. They refused to stock them. When Nintendo came on the scene, wanted to bring the NES to North America, they were actively rejected from putting it in stores. And the only way they were able to get it in stores was to completely redesign it, abstain from using any video game terminology like game or cartridge or anything. In fact, the entire idea was to disguise it as a VCR and as a toy, and basically make it like a Trojan horse. And on top of that, they had to beg stores, beg them to carry the NES by saying they would buy back any inventory that wasn't sold. Now, why was that? Why did this happen? Well, it was from a variety of issues. The main ones were that in 1983, the video game market was oversaturated with a lot of low-quality products that were far, far too expensive. Does any of that sound a little familiar to you? As of the time of recording this, I am 3 days out from the Nintendo Switch 2 launching. Now, I will admit to you off the bat, I did pre-order a Nintendo Switch 2, a decision I regret more and more every day. I did it against my better judgment, but the fact of the matter is, it's too late now. I already paid for it. I can't get a refund on it, which might add a little tiny layer of irony to everything I'm about to tell you, but I want you to listen. I want you to listen good, especially if you care about video gaming as a hobby. We've reached what I call a state of no return with gaming. Now, over the past several years, we've seen a lot of these things that are happening now pick up a lot of steam, things that companies have been trying to slowly introduce and roll out over a long period of time now. The first one, obviously, let's address it right now, pricing. The insane price gouging that is happening on video games. It is remarkable, by the way, the different planets that these corporate people live on from average consumers like you and me, to whom the existing game price was already a little high, a bit of a luxury purchase. Whereas people like Doug Bowser and other rich CEOs want to tell you about how actually it's a steal. Games should be much more expensive. In fact, if they could get away with it, they'd charge you much more for them. Now, there's been a lot of misinformation floating around, so I want to get something off the bat right now. If you've been on the internet the past few years, you probably are already well aware of this, but no matter what the topic is, no matter what the facts are, what the history is, or what the evidence is, or whatever, no matter what it is you're talking about, there will always be a group of people who are in a desperate race to get as far on their knees as possible and convince you that actually everything is fine, that everything a company is doing is completely justified, that it's just nature taking its course. They bring up these arguments like, oh, it's inflation, oh, it has to do with Donald Trump and tariffs, oh, it has to do with this thing or the other. Here, take a look at this Toys R Us catalog that's extremely obscure that I dug out of my mother's basement. If you're here to make any of these arguments, and I have no doubt that my comments are going to be flooded with this kind of tomfoolery, I strongly recommend that you watch a video by Nintendine, that's Ninten and then D-E-A-N, great channel, made a video thoroughly debunking that genre of argument that's been annoyingly perpetuated as of late. But let's call it what it is. It's price gouging. It's price gouging. It's not at all necessary to charge you as much as they want to for games. Let me tell you something, right? Nintendo is not a mom-and-pop shop. If you have an idea that this is something the poor little video game companies need to do, get that idea out of your head right now. A couple years ago, a Nintendo spokesperson went out and literally said, they're so rich, they're trying to invent new ways to spend the money. Okay? They don't need to charge you this much for games. The only reason they need to overcharge you for games is as an artificial crutch if their industry is slowly becoming less profitable. Now, why might that be happening? My friends, it's not just prices that are an issue with video games right now. It's so much more. Me personally, my biggest problem by far with video games right now has a lot more to do with the internet and updates. Let me just say, I'm sure that to many of us, It sounds like a great idea. It sure did when it first started. The idea of the internet being implemented into our game consoles. You can play your favorite games with other people from the comfort of your and their own houses. Your games that you love can be updated over the internet wirelessly to just add new stuff to it, and then you have more stuff to do and more stuff to play in your game. Gee, doesn't that sound great? You can go on a digital store and you can get smaller games for cheaper prices. If there's some sort of problem with your console or whatever, or if the company who made your console wants to give you new features, they can connect to your console wirelessly and just stream them right to you. It all sounds so great on paper, until it reaches its inevitable endpoint, which is the point we're at now, where you realize that, shock of all shocks, video game companies, especially when they get insanely rich, are not quite so benevolent with their decision making. That maybe ulterior motives might be in play, that maybe a system that sounds great could actually be misused for something far worse than the way it's pitched to you as. Thus we reach the state we're at right now, where we have the following problems. Video games, more often than not, coming out in a sorry state. Buggy, they're glitchy, they don't work properly, they're unfinished, they don't have an adequate amount of content, they often don't even have the full amount of content that was intended when the game was conceptualized. And then this is disguised to you as content being added to your games, when in reality it's just the game being finished later. Now for developers, they think this is great, and it is a great crutch. Of course it's a great crutch. You avoid the stress of having to meet your deadlines. You avoid a lot of crunch time. You can just finish your game later by throwing updates on it. I want you to imagine that you go to McDonald's and you order a hamburger and they give you the buns and the pickles, and then about a year later they show up at your door with the patty and the condiments. People can and will debate all day long on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but the fact of the matter is, it never used to be the standard. And that was for good reason. As you can see, I happen to be a fan of older consoles, and I use them often, especially my Nintendo Wii. I love that thing. Let me tell you something about my collection of Wii games, of GameCube games. Those games, all of which are around the 20-year mark now, around 20 years old, work just as well now as they did when they were new, and will work just as well 20 more years from now as they did when they were new. My Nintendo Switch collection already doesn't work as well as it did when it was new, and that generation isn't even technically over yet. Let me tell you a little story. I bought a game a couple years ago. It's called A Hat in Time. Fun game. I bought it digitally, and I bought it with all the DLC. And I played it. I had a great time with it. And as I often do when I get the chance with games I bought digitally, I decided lately that I would get a physical copy of it, since that happens to be available. Why am I bringing this up? Because of the next point I'm making about the internet implemented into gaming consoles. One thing that companies can do when they add updating your console as a feature is they can just retroactively add or change anything they want about the console and how it works and how it looks, and there's nothing you can do about it. Let's just say, as a crazy hypothetical example, that a company called Nintendo wanted to force you to use a system called virtual game cards. A system which is disguised as some sort of pro-consumer move, but in reality is actually just a pathetic and transparent attempt at phasing out physical media. More on that later. And suppose that there was no way to opt out of this being implemented onto every digital game you've bought. And suppose that this incredibly short-sighted, poorly implemented idea, which was band-aided onto your console years and years after it was released, comes with some problems that makes it impossible to do things that were perfectly possible to do before. And you end up with a situation where your physical game that you just bought is essentially a paperweight, because I bought this game with all the DLC, but if I want to remove it from my console, because you now have to do that through the virtual card system, you can't do it through the shop like you used to be able to, well, guess what? I can't just remove the game and keep the DLC. It's impossible. There's no way to do it. I can either delete everything off my system and lose all the DLC, or I can have everything on my system at all times, rendering the cartridge useless and having it take up space on my console at all times when it doesn't have to. The way it used to work with the old system, I could have just deleted the game and re-downloaded the DLC and used the cartridge for the game, but it doesn't work that way anymore. Nintendo didn't think of that, and I just have to suffer for it. Many an example of that sort of thing happening because of the implementation of the internet into our consoles. Oh, but it gets even better, because if I did decide, you know what, let's just forsake the DLC. Doesn't matter anyway, I don't need DLC. Why don't I just play the base game that's on the cartridge? Well, guess what? If I delete everything and go to play the base game that's on the cartridge, it tells me, A required update must be installed for me to even boot the game, and it won't let me turn on the game unless I install it. Which brings up a lot of very fair and reasonable questions, such as, what happens when those servers go down? Because they will one day. What happens if Nintendo goes out of business? What happens, suppose you don't use internet? There will be 1,000 people who say, oh, come on, get real, it's 2025, everyone uses the internet. Well, let me pitch you a better one then. What if you just don't want to? I know I'm not the only one who feels this way, that if something doesn't require the internet, I don't want to have to use it. I think there is a growing amount of people who are sick and tired of the internet being force-fed into every single corner of everything you try to do, regardless of whether it's actually necessary or not to do that thing. Maybe I just don't want to connect to the internet. Maybe when I go to a store and buy something off a shelf, I want to do that with the security and the knowledge that it's going to work and just function the way I bought it without me having to connect to the internet and download a bunch of stuff. And if you feel that way, then you'd best avoid buying a Nintendo Switch 2, because let me tell you something. Nintendo decided to make it so that a Nintendo Switch 2, new at launch, is completely unusable until you download a system update. I can already hear how this board meeting went. I understand it's just a measure to prevent people from leaking the console if they get their hands on it early. But you know what the consequence of that is. Again, bringing up those questions from earlier, suppose you don't have access to internet, the servers go down or whatever. Suppose you end up in a situation where you need to factory reset your Nintendo Switch 2 for any reason, which might happen for any reason. We already know that incompetent coding in consoles can lead to issues that require factory resetting them. Well, the factory settings of this console, by design, makes it unusable. Makes it a very expensive paperweight. So too bad if that happens, and you either have no way of updating it, or some sort of problem comes up, or whatever it may be. You basically have a very expensive paperweight. Then again, you could just have a very expensive paperweight if Nintendo decides they want you to, because one of the clauses they added into their agreement recently that you're forced to sign on to says that at any time they can brick your Nintendo Switch 2 remotely, for any reason of their own discretion. Does that terrify you? Because it should. The implementation of the internet into video game consoles is a poison. It's a toxin, it's a crutch. It leads to the endpoint that we're at now, where the inevitable consequences are the following. Products release incomplete. The standard, the bar, is set far lower for the state a game will come out in, for the state a product is sold to you in. That extends not only to games, but to consoles as well. The console at any point, and the way it works, can be modified at the discretion of the console creator to work in a completely different way than it did when you bought it. And there is nothing you can do about it, because they force you to update these consoles before you can continue using them. A lot of the time, companies will give you, false no options, like, not now, or remind me in 3 days, because companies don't understand the concept of the saying no means no. But with Nintendo, it's real cut and dry. They don't give you a fake no, they just don't give you any no. If they decide you're installing an update, you're installing an update. And if you don't want to, you either can't play your game or can't turn your console on. How well do you think that's going to age years and years from now? When these consoles are in the past, when they're generations gone by. A few generations out from now, when the only way to play these games is the same way that you play Wii or GameCube games now, by buying them retroactively in a used state. Hence the reason why I brought up, all of my Wii and GameCube games work just as well now as when they were new. That already isn't the case with the Nintendo Switch 1, and it won't be the case with the Nintendo Switch 2. And don't even get me started on companies like PlayStation and Xbox. Don't get me wrong, Nintendo is by far not the only ones that have these issues. In fact, if anything, they were the last bastions of these issues not being a problem. That quote about you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain gets truer and truer with each passing year. Nintendo showed up, saved the video game industry. And now they will be the last pillar of its downfall. And I do say downfall. Through all of these problems, and even ones I didn't mention, things being inserted into video games that gamers don't want there, forcing you to use the internet and updates and a bunch of other stuff regardless of whether you want to or not. The planned obsolescence, or in simpler terms, death of preservation of any game you buy now. The fact that they're trying to completely phase out physical games entirely because they hate the idea of you actually owning your products. You hear about these game key cards, and yes, it's not every cartridge, but it is still a focal point of the Nintendo Switch 2's launch, which should be concerning because it means it's probably going to be at least a third of the library, where the game doesn't even come on the cartridge. where you go to a store and buy a useless cartridge that literally just serves as a license to download something. Again, if you ever have to factory reset your console, even forgoing the fact that it makes it completely non-functional. If there's no way to re-download that game, which at some point in the future might be the case, all the time it happens nowadays that games are pulled off digital storefronts, there's no way to get them because of issues with the rights or the company going out of business or whatever it may be. Now you just have a useless piece of junk that you spent $80 on in your house that will never work again, that serves no purpose to anyone. It's useless. They took your money and they kept it, and you get nothing of value in return. This industry is not profitable anymore, not because of any sympathetic reason towards companies and the trade war and any stupid thing you can come up with about inflation that can be thoroughly debunked. No, video games is not profitable anymore because these companies have let the standard get so low that they have to use sneaky tactics to continue making a profit, capitalizing on fear of missing out, FOMO, at every opportunity they possibly get, taking advantage of terrible subscription services that are an awful deal for the people actually using them, and making absolute sure that it is as difficult as possible, if not impossible, for you to use and play older games, for you to have physical games that are reliable. Let me tell you why physical media is so important, because people will make this ridiculous argument that, oh, well, you don't own your physical media either. Let me tell you something. I own Super Mario Galaxy 2 as a disc. Nintendo will never under any circumstance be able to come into my house and take this disc away from me and make it not work anymore. At any time I want, regardless of my internet, regardless of what year it is, I can put this disc in my Wii and it will play the game. At any point in time for the rest of my life, so long as I have this physical object in my possession, it will always work. It will always be what I paid for. That is why physical media is important. That is why people who collect things physically say they own it. Now you can talk about how that's a gray area with modern games that sometimes require downloads or, again, release in a state before updates where they don't have all their content. And for the record, that's absolutely correct. That is a problem with modern games, but it's not a problem with older games. And the greed, oh my goodness, the constant, relentless greed. Releasing old games, ports of old games that are being released more expensive now that they're old than they were when they were new when they came out. Introducing you to these subscription services and then doubling the price halfway through their lifespans. You want to buy an older game such as Super Mario Land 2 or Super Mario Bros. 3? Well, too bad, you can't buy those games. You can rent them, but there is no way to just buy them and have them on your console like you could with something like Virtual Console. It says a lot about Nintendo that they're not doing this in Japan, where they're actually located. And it says even more that they've gone out of their way to region lock the Nintendo Switch 2, an active step backwards from the Switch 1, which was not region locked. You can go to any country and buy a Nintendo Switch game, and it will work on any Nintendo Switch console. I have several European and Japanese games in my Nintendo Switch collection that not only work perfectly fine on my Canadian Nintendo Switch, but automatically load in the English language. Nintendo went out of their way to break that barrier, to make video games universal and get rid of the region lock. And they have now gone out of their way to re-implement it specifically so that you can't import games, so that you have to submit to their price gouging. Let me tell you something. Let me get real with you for a second here. A lot of the time, people support companies that they don't want to, regardless of if it's a fair deal or if they agree with what the company's doing, out of some perceived obligation to support that company, this thing they've fallen in love with. People will talk about how Nintendo fanboys are especially insufferable on this topic. Well, I want you to take a look around you. I am just about the perfect caricature of a Nintendo fanboy ever dreamed up by God. And to that end, I have this to say to you. This is not the company you fell in love with. This is not the company you remember from when you were a kid. I know a lot of people, they end up with one brand or one company or one series or whatever it is that they like, that they pay attention to. As you can see, I'm no exception. Nintendo didn't even play a significant role in my childhood. I really mainly got into it in my early high school years, and thus I ended up in the utopia you see before you. But the reason I fell in love with Nintendo wasn't because they have a bright, colorful mascot and they made good products at one point in time. I'm not a Disney fan, for instance. It takes a little more than that to convince me. No, I fell in love with Nintendo Because Nintendo was a company for a very long time that could be described by a single word, and that word was sincerity. They were always trying to innovate. They were always being very careful about what it was that they were offering to consumers and how fair it was. You can bring back random stray examples from different points in time, from the 80s or the 90s or whatever, of Nintendo doing messed up things. Of course, all corporations do at one point or another. But there's a reason why names like Reggie Fils-Aimé and Satoru Iwata are as revered as they are. I have both Satoru Iwata's book and Reggie Fils-Aimé's book. I highly recommend both of them. And it is astounding to me how it seems like the priceless lessons about business and profitability and customer loyalty that Nintendo should have learned during their time with Iwata and Reggie working at the company. Astounding to me how it seems like they've learned just about nothing from that. Now, for those who aren't terribly familiar with Satoru Iwata, I could go on a long rant about that, and I'll spare you of it for now. But there's a reason why you've probably heard his name before. He's one of the only modern examples, really, of a corporate leader with a strong sense of integrity. He was a man that initially was just a video game fan, the same way you and I were, who happened to end up at the head of a company. And in his heart, Iwata didn't just lead a company that was a corporation that made video games. He had a deep and passionate love, not just of video games as an art form and as a medium, but people. The people who played and bought video games. The people who made video games. He had a personal relationship with just about everyone who worked at his company. He talks about this in the book. He had a very clear standard of ethics as to what he considered acceptable for Nintendo to do. And yes, you can make the argument that Nintendo wasn't a perfect company under Iwata, that they were flawed, that sometimes they had missteps, that not everything he did was successful for the company. But it is inarguable that not only did Satoru Iwata fundamentally change the world forever, that not only would video games not even be half of what it is now, if not for his influence, but that Satoru Iwata was as popular and remembered and beloved as he was for a reason, because he stood for something. And that something was you. And that's the reason why people who lived through the Wii era, the Wii U era, etc., who were a fan of Nintendo in that era, or are actively a fan of that era in retrospect, because of that sincerity, that magic, that charm, that comes directly from that integrity. That's gone now. This is the best example of why brand loyalty is a bad idea, because a company by its very nature, regardless of if a company makes good products and employs decent people and is led by good people with great intentions, a company can be in a state where it's a great company, where you should feel good for supporting it, but inevitably, because it is a company, it's going to change hands. And it's eventually going to end up with leadership, especially if it's a popular or successful company that is not quite so benevolent. Pardon the graphic analogy, because I know it might be upsetting for my fellow Iwata fans, but they could dig him out of the ground, open his casket, and stomp on his corpse, and it would be less insulting and disrespectful than what they have done to Nintendo. Just about everything that the man stood for, just about every do's and don'ts that he laid out during his time there, has been thoroughly violated and forsaken by the current Nintendo that exists today. Nintendo doesn't have that sincerity anymore. They don't have that integrity. They don't have that personal relationship with their fans and their customers that they did back in the day. They pretend to emulate something like that, but they really don't have that anymore. In fact, just about everything that Nintendo was known for has slowly faded away. And now they have a lot of the problems that people specifically chose Nintendo for not having. Releasing consoles that are basically just slightly amped up versions of their last console. Treating their customers terribly. Offering bad services for way too high prices. General disregard for their consumers and the quality of the products they release. Yes, they still have the rights to Super Mario, but that does not make Nintendo Nintendo. That's not what makes or breaks Nintendo, having the right to their original IPs. And yes, there is still a bit of remnant of that Nintendo magic that everybody's so familiar with left in the company. But that's what it is, a remnant. It's been fading away, and it's going to continue fading away. And I know this is really sad to hear, but eventually you're going to see a Nintendo that is unrecognizable. That is just another company that makes consoles and makes games and isn't particularly remarkable in comparison to the other companies. Because they're very much marching in a synergized direction with the other companies and the future that all of those companies and their little coalition in the video game industry want to have. The phasing out of physical games, the phasing out of any control that the consumer has over their products. The price gouging, the insane price gouging. They've been trying to roll this out for a while now. I remember when it was first in talks of, charging $100 for just GTA 6, and everybody lost their mind. I'm not really a GTA person, but why did they want to do that? The same reason I told you before, because video games are becoming less profitable, to the point where they need to pull these sneaky tricks in order to make any sort of profit. Thus brings me to the point I made this video. There's a reason I'm calling this a call to action. There's a reason I've told you all of this up until now. It's not just to complain. It's because you can do something about it. You hear that? That's the sound of your backlog calling you. That's the sound of video games being a hobby with 40 years of history. The reason I brought up the crash of '83 at the beginning of this was to prove a point. And that point is, it's happened before. It can happen again. If anything, it should be a lot easier to do now because, let me tell you, if you're a gamer, if your hobby is gaming, if that's the thing you like to do in your pastime, you can completely sustain that hobby without having to contribute a single penny to the modern gaming industry. Do you know how cheap and easy it is to buy an old console like a Wii and to have access to one of the greatest game libraries of all time? Or better yet, you know how easy it is to mod a console like a Wii? Gosh, you hear that? That's the sound of the emulation scene welcoming you with open arms. That's the sound of your computer or laptop being able to play decades upon decades of video game history that'll take up less than a gigabyte of space on your computer. That's the sound of how easy it is to buy an alternative like a Powkitty, for example, that can emulate pretty much every retro game you'd ever possibly want to play all the way up to the 5th generation with perfect, flawless emulation. That's the sound of how easy it is to go on eBay and buy older games for stuff like the Wii and the GameCube at a much, much more reasonable price that will always be in the same state it was when it launched. I know you might be thinking, well, retro game collecting can get really expensive really fast. But if you know where to look, you can get a lot of hidden gems without having to spend an arm and a leg. In fact, you can buy a lot of games pretty much on the cheap and still have more than enough to entertain yourself. But more than likely, if you consider yourself a gamer, if that's your hobby, you probably already have a collection of video games. You probably already have games that you'd love to go back and play. Now's your chance. And if you're not really into gaming, well, now's a perfect time to catch up on your reading. If this is maybe a hobby that you enjoy passively, now's a perfect time to watch movies. Check out that TV show you've been meaning to. Do any other time-consuming activity that you've been putting off. I'm making a call to action. I'm inviting you, everyone who's watching this, everyone who's disgruntled, who's been able to relate to anything I've mentioned so far. Yes, there are so many people who will scream really angrily about how all of these are just made-up issues. But the fact of the matter is, I'm willing to put my money on that the majority of gamers, the majority of them, have more than one of the issues I've talked about so far, who are sick of this, who are sick of spending too much on products that aren't worth it, who are sick of products coming out in a low-quality state, being completely unoptimized, who are sick of the phasing out of middle ground games, who are sick of being vilified just for trying to own their games and enjoy their hobby, who are sick of having to connect to the internet for everything they want to do. Now's your chance. You can go without buying new video games. Don't contribute to their economy. Don't buy these terrible overpriced systems. Don't buy these terrible overpriced games. Even the good games, don't buy those either. Trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. Don't buy nostalgia-baiting retro game merchandise that you see at Walmart or whatever. You can probably find it cheaper on Etsy anyway. Don't go see their crappy movies. Don't feed money into this economy. Abstain from it. I'm not just talking about Nintendo, I'm talking about all of it. I'm talking about anything that goes in to the modern video game industry. Abstain from it. Completely. It's not difficult to do. So many of us, I'm sure, have felt this thing of, well, I'm just a powerless consumer, what can I do? When these companies have so much influence and so much power and whatever. This is not an example of that. You can be a gamer and have gaming as your hobby without contributing a single penny to the current economy of video games. You can emulate games, you can mod your consoles, you can buy older games for older consoles. And if enough of us band together and stick to this blueprint, we can force these companies into a corner. I know it might sound a little harsh, but that state they were in 1983, where they were desperate, where they had to beg stores to stock their products, let alone beg you as the consumer to even consider buying them, that's the state we need to put them in again. Because if we don't, they'll keep going in this direction. I think that's important to understand. They're not going to get better unless we force them to. In fact, they're going to get infinitely worse. This awful state we're in now with the overpriced games and the phasing out of physical, that can get so much worse than it is right now. And that's where they're trying to bring it. This is a slow experimental rollout they're doing. And you really can speak with your wallet on this. Just don't buy it. Don't contribute to these companies. And continue abstaining from it until somebody comes in and convinces you beyond a shadow of a doubt that a product is worth your money and time. Let me tell you something. You have no obligation to any company. If you're considering spending your hard-earned money on a product that feels unfair, or on an offer that feels like it's not a good deal, that feels like there's not a fail-safe that you won't get screwed over later if a company decides they want to change how things work, don't do it. Don't spend money on it. Especially don't spend money on that if gaming is your hobby and you want to see it to have a future. Don't spend any money on these companies. No money. No money until no more BS. No money until the price is fair, until the quality is up to par, until you as a consumer are sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that you don't have to worry about whether your games are going to be playable in the future, about whether it's going to be the same game when it launches as it is when it's finished, about if you're even going to be allowed to boot it up or turn it on without connecting to the internet first. Say no. Just say no. Buy older games that don't have those problems. Make a statement. It's time for another video game crash. It is time for the video game crash 2. And if you feel the same way that it's time to put these companies in their place, do it. Tell your friends. Spread the word. Talk about it in the comments of this video, on your forums, with your buddies. I mean, really actually stand up to this with no exception, because that's the only way it's going to get done. And I promise you, it will work. It worked in 1983. When it wasn't a movement, it was just a thing that happened. It can certainly work now that we have years and years, decades upon decades of amazing games that we can play at any time without having to feed a single dollar into these modern companies' wallets. Because they're price gouging for a reason, other than just, I mean, it really mostly is just greed. But a big part of it, and why they talk about, oh, we need to do this to save the industry or whatever, that was a talking point when it was GTA, right? Because they know they can't keep this up forever. The fact of the matter is, it's not what the consumers want. And if it's not what the consumers want, the only way to make it work is to force it, which is why they're trying to force it. The reason the industry is not profitable is because they haven't met the standard that they did in past generations. Every project under the sun is either extremely severely overfunded, which I know that sounds counterintuitive that a product would turn out bad when more money is funneled into it, but a lot of the time that's what happens. I'm sure many of you can come up with examples of this. Or an indie game. And those are basically your only option. Either a giant multi-million-dollar AAA slop fest or a little tiny indie game. Gone are the days of buying, I don't know, Winnie the Pooh's Rumbly Tumbly Adventure. There's no variety. Everything is so uninspired and bland and expensive at that. It's always up in the air whether or not something you buy is actually going to still work 10 or 20 years down the line. Don't stand for it. Don't feed money into it. Say no. No more money until there's no more BS. Because the glory of capitalism, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you create a vacuum, eventually somebody's going to come in and fill the vacuum. Eventually, the same thing that happened in 1983 will have to happen again, where if you abstain for long enough, and enough of us do it in large enough numbers, somebody will have to come in and convince us, not the other way around, convince us that they have something that's worth your dollar. Whether that's one of these companies like Nintendo redeeming themselves, going in a new direction that's more pro-consumer, or a new player entering the ring. Let me tell you something. If a company came out tomorrow and announced a new console that has good specs that either isn't implemented with internet, updating or whatever, or doesn't even have internet, I'd buy it in a heartbeat because I'm sick of it. And I know so many of you are as well. Let's make this a movement. I'm serious. Spread the word. Tell your friends about it. Focus on your backlog, or emulation, or modding, or other hobbies, or whatever it is that you want to do. Because it's really not difficult to do that, I assure you. Because let me tell you a great fact of life. If you have to force something, eventually it's going to fail. And this shift away from physical media, consumers don't want it. It's forced. And the longer they try to force it, eventually they're going to have to realize and accept the fact that they can't force it. That they can try all they want to phase it out with their little coalition, but eventually something will fill that vacuum. If not just people taking care of it themselves. Yahar and all that. We can make this happen. We can make it go viral or whatever. Talk about it. Spread the word. Tell your friends about it. Come up with catchphrases or whatever. I'm not really good with that sort of thing. But most importantly, just adhere to this as a code. Make it your personal code. Abstain from giving these companies money in any way, shape, or form. Abstain from it completely. You can keep being a gamer and you can keep sustaining that hobby for the entire rest of your life without even having to give a single penny to any of them. And that is my call to action for you, fellow gamers. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it amped you up. You can go years without buying a modern game. Let's see how many years they can go without a paycheck.